Meeting this afternoon. My name is Gustavo Pallares. I'm Deputy Secretary General from the Osce Parliamentary Assembly, and greetings from the Osce PA's headquarters here in Copenhagen, Denmark. Welcome to our web parliamentary dialogue, which is organized with the goal to facilitate interparliamentary discussion on the most important security issues. This event in particular will focus on the topic of transparency and predictability in military affairs, the role of the OSCE. Allow me some technical details before entering into the substance of the meeting and before passing the floor to the chair of the General Committee on Political Affairs and Security, Congressman Richard Hudson, who will chair our meeting. I would like to address several technicalities of our event. Please note that this webinar is being recorded and broadcasted live on YouTube and Facebook. If you have any connection problems, please contact our team, who will do their best to support you. Their contact details will be put on the chat function. We have 3 language interpretation into English, French, and Russian. You can select your preferred language by clicking on the little globe at the bottom of the screen. Please note that requests to take the floor should be written in the webinar chat, and you will be given the floor during the open debate. Finally, I will encourage all speakers to be succinct and focus in the remarks. Keeping your remarks short and to the point will hopefully mean that we won't have to impose time limitations and that everybody will have the chance to speak. Without further delay, I would like to pass the virtual floor to the chair of the General Committee on Political Affairs and Security of the Osce Parliamentary Assembly, Congressman Richard Hudson. Congressman, please.
Thank you, Gustavo. As usual, I'm grateful to you and all your colleagues at the Secretariat for all you do to ensure the important work of our Assembly goes on in these difficult times. Colleagues, it's nice to see your faces, even though it's through the screen. I can't tell you how much I'm looking forward to seeing many of you in a few weeks in Vienna, and then hopefully more soon thereafter. I'm really eager for us to get back to meeting in person. Lord Bowness is our esteemed president is joining us today, and I just wanted to acknowledge him, thank him for his time, and also for his incredible leadership during these very challenging times. It's really an honor to work with you, sir, and thank you for joining us today. Also, I would just wanted to give an opportunity. I believe our Secretary General Roberto Montella may want to say a few words at this time. Roberto, I would open the floor to you if you'd like to make a few remarks.
Thank you very much, Richard. Thank you very much. And welcome to all our members and guest panelists. We have so many events leading up to the annual session, and it's nice to see that there is still a robust participation, and I'm sure the theme of today warrants for very good attention. Transparency and predictability in military affairs are a crucial issue for security. And unfortunately today, this transparency is at risk due to growing tensions and mistrust. And in the OSCE, indeed, we work on establishing trust and in building confidence among participating states. This is one of the most challenging exercise, and on building trust is an exercise that requires a lot of also of personal rapport with your interlocutors. And hopefully in our annual session in Vienna, we will also have an opportunity to meet face to face and to work on increasing trust and building confidence among ourselves. Moreover, the withdrawal of the United States and Russia from the Open Skies Treaty is an extremely worrying development in this regard. And I'm sure that this exercise today will also help us look into these matters. Parliamentarians with the oversight capacity play a very important role on this, and I hope this web dialogue can be useful to enhance knowledge of the current mechanism for military transparency, as well as the support to the FSC and the FSC support unit, the OSCE Conflict Prevention Center, in their very work. Thank them for their support and their participation in this meeting. Richard, thank you very much. Special thanks to you, to your leadership, to the Helsinki Commission's work and helping us putting together this seminar. So I yield back to you, and I look forward to hearing what you have to say. George.
Thank you, Roberto, and thank you for your strong leadership during a very challenging times, both with the pandemic as well as the developments with the OSCE itself. Really appreciate you and your staff very, very much. Let me just say a few words to introduce our discussion and our speakers. And as usual, I'll try to keep my remarks short and would ask all our colleagues to do the same. Our work together once again aligns with what I believe is the most crucial role of this committee, which is working towards a free and peaceful OSCE zone in which all participating states fully implement the fundamental principles that we have agreed to under the Helsinki Final Act. Today's discussion will focus on the ways in which OSCE participating states have committed to the principle of predictability and transparency in military affairs, and in ways in which we are meeting or falling short of our commitments. Colleagues, many of you know that on March 24th of this year, I was invited to speak on behalf of the committee to the closing session of the U.S. chairmanship of the OSCE's Forum for Security Cooperation, or the FSC. I reminded the FSC that the need to build confidence among states, the very core of the FSC's mandate, appears time and again in the declarations adopted by our committee. That includes the resolution we passed at the annual session in 2019, which started our collective regret regarding, and I'll quote here, the general deterioration in the interlocking architecture of arms control agreements and confidence building and transparency measures, including the Open Skies Treaty, the Conventional Armed Forces in Europe Treaty, and the Vienna Document, which have all been undermined by Russian non-compliance, making it necessary for all sides to recommit to the preservation of effective arms control, disarmament, and non-proliferation. Today's webinar should be seen as a continuation of the concern that we collectively expressed in our 2019 declaration and of our intent to do something about it. For my part, I'm especially eager to learn more from our distinguished experts about the continued relevance of the confidence building measures contained in the Vienna Document. I hope our experts will help us understand where these commitments came from, why the Vienna Document is still relevant today, and how we might best modernize it to address our region's most pressing security challenges. Colleagues, let me now introduce the three eminent experts invited by the Secretariat to inform us and introduce our discussion. Their full biographies have been circulated, so please allow me to very briefly summarize. Our first speaker is Professor Beatrice Heuser, Chair of International Relations at the University of Glasgow. Her distinguished academic career has been complemented by stints at NATO headquarters and with the German Armed Forces. Professor Heuser's research interests include a focus on the political dimensions and impact of military exercises. I understand she'll be speaking to us about the history of military information exchange and the background of the Vienna Document. Professor Heuser, is a very great pleasure to have you here with us today. Our second speaker will be Mr. Robin Mosenkoff, Senior FSC Support Officer at the OSCE Conflict Prevention Center. Mr. Mosenkoff, formerly a career officer in the Royal Netherlands Air Force, served with distinction in a number of posts, culminating in service as defense attaché in Austria, Hungary, and Slovakia, and senior military advisor to the Dutch mission to the OSCE. He's been with the OSCE Conflict Prevention Center for more than 5 years, working to supporting the goals and objectives of the Forum for Security Cooperation, including leading discussions on confidence and security building measures. In a word, he's the man to know on the inside when talking about the Vienna Document. And we have asked him to brief us on the agreements currently in place and the state of their implementation. Dear Mr. Mosenkoff, thank you very much for being with us here today. Our third presentation will come from Dr. Ian Anthony, Director of the European Security Program at the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. A prolific author and commentator, and no stranger to OSCE meetings, Dr. Anthony is a renowned expert on issues including military risk reduction in Europe. I very much look forward to his analysis and the current challenges in regional security. Thank you, sir, for being here as well. Colleagues, I encourage once again all those who may be interested to intervene in the discussion to already register through the chat function. I'll ask Gustavo, as has become customary for us in these online meetings, to moderate the question and answer session for us. With that, Professor Heuser, you have the screen. I believe you're still on mute.
Thank you very much. I hope you can see my screen, and I hope you can now see the proper layout. Is that correct? It should read
Yes.
Exercises, Accidents and Misunderstandings. Thank you. I'm going to teach you, my grandmothers, to suck eggs, as we say in English, which means I'm going to tell you lots of things you know, but I think sometimes spelling them out and putting them in perspective is useful. So let me just start with the political as opposed to the technical or tactical purposes of military exercises. Why does one hold military exercises other than quite literally try one's new tank or try one's new particular formation? There is the element of reassuring friends and allies. There are exercises in support of particular reforms and standardization, perhaps across different alliances. But there are also exercises as tools of diplomacy, which might be to reward good behavior or to signal displeasure. One might have somebody with whom one wants to have an exercise, and then at the last minute one says, well, because you've done something that we didn't like, we are going to cancel our exercise. But they could also be used to intimidate and coerce by having very strong forces somewhere near your frontier, which makes you rather intimidated. And then there is, of course, the element of deterring potential adversaries. As I said, this is apart from the technical, the tactical purposes. The problem about this is that in the past, there have been instances where exercises have served either as a cover for or a distraction from actual military operations. And this is where I'm putting on my hat as an historian. I'm telling you about all the things that the Wehrmacht did when it started its Polish invasion of 1939. By having exercises along the Polish frontier, or the Weserübung 1940, which was the Wehrmacht preparation for the invasion of Norway, much more famous. Actually, the invasion, the Barbarossa invasion of Russia was also prepared by military exercises. Then we do actually know that the Soviet Union and its satellites, even before the Warsaw Pact was created, had learned from the enemy. The Soviet military had learned from what the Nazis, the Wehrmacht, did to the Soviet Union in 1941, and therefore translated it into its own behavior, realized that this was something quite effective. So there were plans in 1951 to 53 to use exercises in Hungary and Bulgaria as a cover and a preparation to bring Tito's Yugoslavia to heel when that was proving rather too independent, something that was then blocked off by various other measures. But interestingly, the plans seem to be persuasive. It's quite persuasive that they existed. We also know that there was the exercise to Shomava that prepared the crushing of the Prague Spring. And we also know that lots of disciples, should we say, disciple militaries of the Soviet Union at the time learned these tricks from the Soviet Union, as it were, which were particularly the preparations that Egypt made to prepare the Yom Kippur War, the Iraqi exercises of 1990, Iraq having been another military that had been trained up by Soviet advisors, used it to prepare the invasion of Kuwait in 1990. And we know of a couple of other exercises where military clashes where exercises happened in the context of these. That means that exercises in a larger crisis context can have some destabilizing effects. Because in the past exercises have masked preparation for the offensive, because they have served as distractions from an offensive elsewhere, because of all these historical experiences, fears can be created when exercises are conducted. The question, therefore, is how does one communicate effectively with a fearful adversary? An adversary who is already set to potentially misinterpret, but perhaps rightly interpret. In any case, an adversary who is potentially out there and who is going to be very suspicious about every information that he is given. Remember that in a crisis context, decision makers tend to have, and this is all the sort of political science literature that has been made of this, all the studies that have been made. It can enhance tunnel vision, that people don't really see lateral events. And that there is an intended or unintended distortion of events by the media that can take place, that there is an increased risk for unintended incidents to be interpreted as intended incidents. That's extremely important and extremely dangerous, of course. And therefore the risk of an escalation that is not intended, but then somehow becomes a crucial factor in a crisis itself. And of course, in a crisis context, there is an increased threat perception on the whole. The problem then again is communication. How do you communicate with somebody who is suspecting you of being dishonest in everything you're saying? Let me just take some of you outside of the OSCE area and just run past you one particular exercise that was very much in danger of blowing up in a big way. It was an exercise along the India-Pakistan border, in which the Pakistani leadership thought that this Indian exercise was in fact a cover for war preparation. There is still some speculation apparently about the intention of the Indian leaders. In any case, the crisis was aborted because there was US political intervention. But for all sides, this was an exercise which could really have gone very badly wrong. And it just shows, again, the potential that this is something that is not just an issue of paranoia within our own area, but it's something that is a more general phenomenon. And let me give you also something from sort of the other side of the story. It's fascinating how in an interview with Saddam Hussein, the following comments have been picked up. Now, this is Saddam Hussein explaining how he took the decision to invade in Kuwait in 1990 and in what context, because he interpreted, he said, the exercises that had been going on before that between the United States and Kuwait in the following way. He said that regarding the kind of message sent to his own state, he said that this confirmed our information that there was a conspiracy around Iraq. And in his opinion, the visit of General Schwarzkopf to Kuwait that had taken place just before that had provided further confirmation of this, because General Schwarzkopf, in a visit to Kuwait, had done some sand planning and wartime preparations of invasion of Iraq, some sort of exercise that was interpreted in that way. And to get to the next one, when somebody replied to Saddam Hussein that the US military visits many countries throughout the world, conducting exercises of all sorts, which are not indicators of any conspiracy, Saddam Hussein asked, in what other country did Schwarzkopf do sand planning like Kuwait? When exercises of planning cast Iraq as the enemy and include ways to defend Kuwait or attack Iraq, this is a different situation than the other exercises. So clearly out of the situation of a particular crisis, a particular perception of something, a misperception was created that then gave him the justification, at least to his own mind, to proceed with his attack on Kuwait. And a colleague of mine has put it very, very interestingly, because he's pointed at the security dilemma here, in which he said, a moment after which additional threats may become counterproductive, you have the security dilemma. Instead of leading to an actor's restraint, an action will provoke escalation. When the culminating point of deterrence is crossed, a threat becomes more likely to incite the opponent to attack rather than back down. So this interesting point is that Dima Adamski has looked at something which we've normally seen as part of a more general sort of arms race or something like that, as something that can also apply to military exercises, that within such a military exercise that may be designed exclusively for deterrence, a culmination point can be reached where any defensive measures can be seen as dangerous by the other side. And he continued, this culmination point of deterrence is similar to the diminishing marginal returns in economics theory. After this point, credible threats become so convincing that the adversary feels cornered with nothing to lose, assumes that the enemy is about to strike anyway, and decides to preempt, thus overreacting. You all know the Vienna Document. This is why the Vienna Document was created, and this is why the Vienna Document stipulates that you should have exercises announced in advance so as to be as transparent as possible about them. No need for me to go into the details of that, but let me just finish with the challenges there. So the challenges are how to ensure in such a context that one's own message about an exercise, about one's intentions, does actually get across, possibly to a very suspicious adversary or neighbor, whatever, to overcome conspiracy thinking and confirmation bias, to eschew mirror imaging if the other side is used to doing using its own exercises in order to cover up some military moves. They assume, and I've gotten past evidence for this, they will assume that their adversaries do it as well. And it is incredibly difficult to know for us how the other side really reads our actions, what they read into our actions, not just how they interpreted what we're doing, but also what they project into this. My apologies to any French colleagues present, but this is a particular 14th of July parade that I was present at. I'd just like to point out, anybody among you who's ever had any military experience will imagine that it is crucial for the career of any officer or any person at all involved in running such a parade to get this right, to make sure that the right color canisters end up in the right aircraft. You can assume with 100% confidence that this accident on such a high profile occasion was not planned, that the accident of having the wrong color canister in the aircraft on the extreme left was not planned. Everybody was highly embarrassed about this. I'm sorry to be using this example, but it is just totally a foolproof demonstration of the fact that accidents will happen and that accidents can be entirely unplanned and can be totally misinterpreted if they come in a crisis situation. So to come back to our challenges, the most difficult thing is to eliminate accidents. We cannot eliminate them, and we have no idea how accidents will be interpreted in a context of crisis where the other side is likely to, more likely than in any other situation, to misread them, to think that they might have been intentional, and to see them as something that might lead to escalation. So I therefore urge greatest transparency possible and greatest predictability possible, to echo what the chairman of your committee just said to you at the introduction. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. Mr. Masikoff, you now have the floor.
Thank you very much, Congressman Hudson, and also thank you to the organizers for giving me the opportunity to speak, which I will do very much in my personal capacity, although I am part of the CPC and Secretariat, with inside knowledge, as you mentioned it, from the Vienna Document and how that goes down, especially when discussing it with 57 participating states. So, but I'll be very careful, trying not to overstep my own boundaries here. I hope I can share my screen. Yes, I can. There we go. I'll speak a bit about the commitments. And of course, Professor Heusser's overview already gave you quite a sharp view of what we're dealing with nowadays, especially when looking at exercises, which are a worrying trend to many participating states, which they try to deal with in either changing the current commitments or seeking ways to get more clarity on reading the adversary or neighboring state's intent, because that's exactly what it's about. But I'll just give you a quick rundown, a very quick rundown of various options we have in the Vienna Document, which I was asked to do from the perspective of looking from the inside out. Of course, I do hope you've read it once. You can download it from the website in 6 languages, and it has a various amount of chapters. One of them, I personally think, is the most important one, the chapter where you exchange military information, exchange your force strength, exchange what kind of weapon systems you have. And let's not forget, even that we try to tinker and to change it and to modernize it, this is quite forward-leaning for any organization in the world, where the Northern Hemisphere basically exchanges information on what they have in the zone of application, as we call it, from the Atlantic Ocean to the Urals, roughly. So all states basically know what's in there. And that's an extremely important part of transparency and building confidence, as long as it's true to the letter. And to be honest, the non-compliance actually comes from a couple of states, but they're really not the main states inside the OSCE area. You talk about the odd Andorra or Vatican not informing us of a nil report, or those in Central Asia. I talk about several states there which are not necessarily living up to this, but to be very honest, they're a bit outside the zone of application. They're officially inside the zone of application, and they should be exchanging information, but those are the ones missing out on the fifth number 57 here. But this is a very high level of compliance in the exchange of information, which is true to its sense. It's on the force posture, on troops they have, on the 5 categories, main categories of classical armaments, and that's not nothing. And that includes the exchange of information yearly on which new weapon system or changed weapon systems they're intending to deploy in the zone of application. Chapter 2, equally important, on defense planning. We get the information on defense planning, on the budgets, which have been agreed to by parliaments, which means you have a basis for discussion on where a country is going to. What's the trend? What's the trend in doctrine? We discussed this. Even this year, the United States, as a chair of the FSC, held a high-level military doctrine, where the very high military level states discuss on what kind of doctrinal changes they have been experiencing and what kind of trends they're looking into. So I think that other than asking for more doctrine seminars, which really is an exchange of views between all 57 states, I think is highly valuable when you talk about transparency again here. And as you can see, okay, 2020 was an odd year. We had the pandemic. Several states were missing out. But I don't think that was a conscious attempt. We have a fairly high degree of information. Now, if you compare this to the odd information exchanges being done on the UN, for instance, this is really very high of the 57 states we have. Now, chapter 3 is where it becomes very interesting, because also Professor Horser just talked about risk reduction. What's the intent of an exercise? What's going on on a military activity which a state is concerned about? For that, we have chapter 3. It's a so-called risk reduction chapter, and states can hold each other accountable. At least they can call each other out and say and ask them what they're doing. Now, obviously, this was done in the past, especially with a view towards former Yugoslavia. We saw it in '99 from Belarus on the Kosovo activities, in Kyrgyzstan on several border-related aspects, and from 2014. Even as much as 2 months ago in April, Ukraine calling out Russia on their exercise close to the borders. Of course, you can have large discussions on what has been discussed and whether it's useful or not, but the fact of the matter is that there is a mechanism for transparency. And of course, when one state has a certain view of whether you should be concerned or not, is one example of how assessments are being done. It cannot be only one-sided. It needs to be done by two sides, and we'll come to that later in the Q&A, no doubt. Also on the aspects which Professor Horser mentioned on unintended distortion by the media, how large an exercise is it routine or not, is the equipment there as it is advertised on the website, and shouldn't it have been notified or not? Those are issues also depending on the level of transparencies that you're seeking. I will not ponder upon this too long. I have 10 minutes, so I need to crack on. I think the context chapter is very often overlooked because it's not only once in the 5 years that states are invited to an airbase or a military facility or can observe a certain military activity, but it's also on many voluntary measures which are stated in here. Yes, they are voluntary, but there is a lot what you can do with the current instrument in trying to make sure you have the transparency that is wished for in order to reduce tensions. And I think this is a very, very important chapter, which was written very, very well back in the 90s and what is intended here. The context, it's a typical 5-year cycle where we see these visits to airbase and military facilities, but also there we see a fairly high level of compliance with this particular aspect. And make no mistake, this is a group of 80 to 100 people, military very often, which go to an airbase or military facility to have eyes on how that airbase or military facility works. So that goes even deeper than just mere counting or having limitations on arms control. These are the paragraphs that also Professor Horser alluded to, the so-called thresholds. This can be played around with, obviously, if you have a bit under 9,000 in combat troops and supporting troops. If it were a bit over that, and on websites, you very often see that. On the website, it's 15,000, 20,000 troops, but state will say, well, it's under the notification levels, it's under 9,000 combat troops, which are being used. The websites are not being done by those who have and know what the Vienna Document is about. Needs to be done 42 days in advance. And here's where these, what also Professor Horser alluded to as a surprise, how did you say this? Surprise readiness checks. There's no such thing. There's just in the Vienna Document something which can be notified or something which is not notified. And if it's notified not 42 days in advance, but it is over the threshold, That means that the troops weren't informed in advance. And at the same time, when the troops are being informed, also all the other participating states are informed. You can have your thoughts if a readiness check on, let's say, 15,000 or 20,000 troops is really a readiness check. If your troops are ready at that level that they can move at the first day notice. I know when I was in NATO, it took me a year to get more than 1,000 troops moving. So you'd have to wonder what is a readiness state that you're able to do that. But this, again, is an assessment that state needs to make. That's not up to us. And of course, the observation thresholds, which means that in principle, all states are invited with 2 people per state to observe the particular activity if it's over 30,000 or 300 battle tanks. These are the exercises in the past. As you can see, an upgoing trend after 2014. I think you all know why. But nevertheless, these are all the exercises, big and small. These were notified, but if you take away the threshold, then this is what you have. It also makes clear that there is definitely an increase after 2014 in larger exercises, which also is a signal. The assessment of the signal is something that states, again, need to look at. Compliance and verifications, the Vienna document, and that's actually working quite well. They inspect 3 times a year, they evaluate once per 60 units a year as well. And it's actually quite high, at a quite high level, about in total, say 150 inspections and evaluations per year, which is not nothing. Of course, we had a drop in 2020, clearly COVID related, but this would normally go back to its usual levels, I would say. And not forget chapter 10 on regional measures. I think this is also very often overlooked, but this gives you the opportunity to go over and beyond what 57 states agree to. And we'll see typical bilateral measures, or for instance, the Dayton Article 4, which is a treaty on arms control, but it is sub-regional. And it's also registered under chapter 10 of the Vienna document. And as you can see, additional measures were taken. These are inspections which were done as well under this chapter 10 arrangement. So that comes on top of the about 150 inspections evaluations per year. Now, there are proposals to adapt. I think Congressman Hudson called it the Modernization Proposals. They are focused on more transparency and reducing these risks that the professor talked about, lowering thresholds, more briefings in the forum, not necessarily voluntarily, but also mandatory, extra quota when activities were not notified, the so-called surprise or snap exercises, and special inspections when there are concerns over unusual military activity. Although it's difficult to get a good idea on how that would go if there would be no consent from one state to go in, because then you would talk about forced entry, which is difficult to imagine with unarmed observers. But to be honest, there are no real proposals for actual modernization, which means emerging technologies, new capabilities, UAVs, long-range precision-guided munitions, hypervelocity or hypersonic weapons. It's not really there, or naval assets, for instance. So you won't find those in the proposals. So you also have to look at what is not there, what apparently is not something that all of the states would like to have. Now, obviously, with the FSC not moving forward on these adaptations of the Vienna document, you will have, you need another way out, if you will. 2016, the structured dialogue, which states in its declaration to work towards creating an environment to reinvigorate arms control and CSBMs, because the FSC was going around in circles. So the structured dialogue with the collective ownership of the 57 states, some inputs from think tanks initially, which we support as well, but very much in a facilitative way, should go forward. And tomorrow, actually, sorry, Tuesday and Friday, Thursday and Friday, we'll have another iteration of the structured dialogue, which really tries to focus on everything the states want, and that's not necessarily all converging, and that needs still a lot of dialogue. We have some interesting outcomes, for instance, the Information Management and Reporting System, or IMARS, points of contact, and measures on transparency, risk reduction, and incident prevention, so-called TRIP, which is also on the table and being discussed as we speak. Concluding remarks, many commitments actually do already exist. Let's not just do away with the Vienna document. I would say it is not broken. But there's definitely a difference in letter and spirit, where there is this intent to make clear what you actually are doing and be as open as possible. Modernization is not necessarily really modernization. I would call it more of an update or adapting it to current realities. And there is a maximum comfort level with transparency. States are not always willing to go the extra mile. We always need to look at all states and not only just focus at one. But I would place a big question mark here, and we need to wonder if rebuilding trust and predictability is really high enough on everyone's agenda. Back in the 90s or even 80s, there were a lot of diplomats in Vienna focused on only getting the job done. Not entirely sure if that's necessarily the case for 57 here. And how to move away from that zero-sum game. Defense deterrence on the one hand by a group of states, larger group of states, trying to approach détente, as it was mentioned then back in the 70s, up to what the Vienna Document is now. Reinvent diplomacy, if you will, and to de-escalate. It's not, these are difficult terms to work with in nowadays security situation, but this is, I think, the only way out. For me, this is my short intervention. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dr. Anthony, you're recognized.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak with you. My task is to talk about some of the challenges which we face in promoting transparency and predictability. And I'd like to start really at the top level by pointing to the changed context in which the conversation is taking place. The most substantial revision to the Vienna Document in the late 1990s really took place in an entirely different security context in Europe. We have a situation today where a Europe-wide conflict is now a planning assumption, at least for many states. That doesn't mean it's a prediction or an expectation, but it's certainly there in planning. We've also come through a period where what you might call local conflicts, although they have a very destructive effect and lead to significant loss of life, local conflicts occur at roughly 6-year intervals in the OSCE area. And where many participating states also have a southern dimension to their thinking about military. Participating states engage now in different kinds of operations in the Middle East, in North Africa, in the Sahel region. So one way or another, military thinking has really moved up the hierarchy of political concerns across Europe. And that's really creating this wider context for the conversation. It's also leading to significant changes at a national level, major increases really in the allocation of resources to defense. And those are in many countries actually shielded during the pandemic. So even though public finances have been under great strain, countries haven't reduced their commitment really to making the prudent investments as they see them in their national defense. And that spending in some countries is expected to have a sort of transformational impact. A transformational impact which will produce armed forces that may even displace some of the traditional capabilities that the Vienna Document is essentially keyed to. So that reporting mechanisms that exist today, like the annual exchange of military information or the general exchange of military information, are increasingly perhaps going to be keyed to legacy systems. As Robin's pointed out, that doesn't mean they're not important, but it does mean that there is going to be a shift in the way that countries think about, if you like, arms race stability. Where are these investments taking us if you look at them in the aggregate? Another important change in the context is the increased attention paid to what is sometimes called the gray zone on the peace-conflict spectrum. That you have a lack of clarity perhaps about where the threshold might be between what we could call muscular competition and conflict. And a lack of understanding about what are the vectors for escalation, whether they're principally geographic or cross-domain, and perhaps a new pattern of risk assessment, where we don't really know or understand what are the acceptable levels of risk. what a country is willing to accept in terms of risks, and what are the implications of different types of actions. And as has already been pointed out, this plays out in a situation where the strategic geography of Europe is entirely different, where small forces may be exposed to superior numbers with no strategic depth for orderly withdrawal, but where significant strike forces can be organized at short notice, bringing in power projection from outside the immediate area. And where information and control of information are increasingly important in shaping a narrative around this muscular competition. As was already pointed out, in the current conditions, there's no guarantee that you can have immediate access to accurate information, or that you can control a political narrative in a world of social media, et cetera, et cetera. So crisis instability as well as arms race instability are factors which play out in a quite different context from the one that we faced when the main changes to the Vienna Document were made. Now, in fact, the agenda for the 2000s actually anticipated quite a lot of the changes which are still on the table. A lot of the things that Robin pointed to as current discussions around how to adapt the Vienna Document were already on the table in the late 1990s. But essentially the process stopped, and it hasn't really kept pace with this wider change in the strategic context. I agree with Robin as well that the structured dialogue creates a promising avenue, perhaps, or a promising framework for having a discussion at an operational level. But I think realistically, the only way we're going to see significant change is with a higher level political impulse to the process. Most of the issues that are on the table are not going to be resolved through horizontal discussions among mid-level officials. And that, I think, is a key intervention point for the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly. That political impulse is really needed if the process is going to be brought in line with the current challenges. But in the interim, I think a net assessment of where the current steps are taking us would be an extremely useful thing to have. A lot of decisions are being taken nationally, but to put them into some kind of international comparative framework and see where we're headed and whether the place that we seem to be going is where we really want to be going, I think would be a very useful exercise. And that's something which, again, I think parliamentarians and the Parliamentary Assembly are very well placed to lead and to call for. So with that, thank you again for the opportunity.
Thank you very much. Dear members, it's now time for us to move on to the next item of our agenda, the open debate. I'm looking forward to your reactions to the fascinating presentations we've just heard. Gustavo, I don't know if anyone's in the queue yet. I'm prepared to ask some questions here at the beginning, and then I'll turn over to you for Q&A. Does that sound right?
Yeah, that's right, Congressman. If you go ahead, we don't have anybody in the list at the moment, so we will wait and wait for members or any of the participants to sign up in the speakers list in our chat. In the meantime, sir, if you have any questions, please go ahead.
Great. Well, and I would just encourage my colleagues, if you have questions, just go into the chat and let us know that you'd like to be recognized for an intervention, and we'd be happy to recognize you. Thank you, all three of our experts for great testimony here. I'll start with Professor Heuser. Under what conditions have transparency measures such as the Vienna Document been most or least successful? And what can we learn from the history, which you've laid out very well, of the application of these measures to make them more effective today?
A very brief answer to this. I mean, the document has only been in existence for a relatively short period of time. All the examples that I was citing, or the earlier examples I was citing, the important examples that actually led to outright war, have been before the document existed. But obviously, the great concern now would be the document being suspended or not being followed up. We have seen that Mr. Mosinkov told us that, in fact, it is being respected despite the fact that it's in need of being extended or renewed or whatever. So in the past, the worst situations occurred when there was no such framework as the OSCE. So the things like, for example, 1990, invasion of Kuwait, or that sort of situation that was without any comparable framework. The very existence of the document is great. That's what I'm saying.
Great. Does anyone else want to jump in?
Yeah, if I may, just very quickly on this topic. I think it's absolutely right, Professor Horser said, that it wasn't there, but also that it didn't have that impact outside the region of where participating states are located. So I think the fact that the Vienna document, I was giving a lecture in New Delhi the other year, and there was absolutely no transparency, not even about one soldier doing any activity between India and Pakistan. I'm just saying that obviously the fact that we have that kind of transparency, we cannot really measure how much it led to tensions not being there. In the past 30 years, it has been in existence. But on the other end, I think we also should try to use the Vienna document still to its max. The fact that one state can call another state out under Chapter 3, I think is great testimony to the fact that it can be done. The states come together. I remember, was it Sunday or Saturday? And we can argue at length that one state maybe didn't answer the way we hoped they would answer, or they evaluated this particular call to the table themselves. But that is an important fact in itself, so that you can use that under this provision to come together and to have a dialogue about it. So how much effective is that? But implementation itself, it's not only to the letter. I think the spirit is something that is very often called upon. We have to be careful with that, because many states don't want to have that spirit giving as much transparency as others would like. There's a limit to the comfort level of transparency, I would say. Thank you.
Chair, could I just make a comment on the
Sure.
part of your question which addressed what could be done better? I think there is an issue inside the OSCE about the way information is used. If you look across the spectrum of OSCE activities, whether they're in Vienna, whether they're in the field, whether they're in the specialized agencies, there's a huge amount of information. So that when something like the events that happened in Nagorno-Karabakh occur, to be honest, nobody is genuinely surprised. A lot of that information was already in the system, but it's not brought together in a way that is consistent and coherent horizontally. And as important, there's no vertical process for presenting it at the higher political level in a way that brings about rapid action. So the way in which the information can be assembled into reports that can be sent vertically to senior political leaders in a format they can digest and understand and use in a timely way is something that OSCE should pay more attention to, because there's a huge amount of information there which is not really exploited effectively.
That's a very interesting point. I guess I would just open up to everybody as we look at that idea of how to vertically integrate. How has that been done in the past? What are some examples where this has been done kind of on a routine basis and maybe versus emergency basis? What does it look like? And do the other witnesses agree with Dr. Anthony that that's definitely improvement that's needed? I'll just open that up to anybody.
Happy to give a quick reaction on that. I think there are two things important here. One is using the huge amount of data which we have assembled over the past 30 years. And I think these initial versions of the structured dialogue where we had, we were bringing that together and basically showing to states how much there is already. It's a gold mine, to be honest. And that's exactly what that acronym IMARS tries to do. The information management and reporting system which we're building for the states. It's not for, well, initially it's for us to assemble the information, but at the end of the day, the states can analyze much, much better that data warehouse of information and make crosscuts and make analysis and trends. Of course, for those states which have changed information, because to be honest, not all states exchange information, and some even contest that the information exchange is correct. So there's always a couple of rough edges to that. But yes, we can be much better. That's one. Secondly, the vertical information, and I know this myself, I was in that position, on a national position as well, the disconnect that there have become after 30 years almost, I would say, being complacent, or 25 years maybe, of being complacent with the routine exchange of information, led to a more distant, a larger distance between those bringing in the information from verification agencies and those tapping into the higher level of the military, let alone not even talking about foreign affairs, who can actually do something with that information. So that disconnect is quite large. So in order to bring that back, there needs to be a massive urgency behind it. And like you just said, Congressman Hudson, is there an emergency? Then it comes very quickly. But is this a routine direct channel that those verification units have? I doubt it. So there is the disconnect, which definitely should be made if we think it's important. But you know, that question I think goes for everything. Do we think it's important enough? Thank you.
Appreciate that. So one of the, I think Dr. Masikoff, you mentioned India is kind of a place that Mike could learn lessons from this framework in the OSCE. Are there other places around the world where you think this could be useful for them to adopt this type of process? I'll open it up to anybody.
And thank you for uptaking me to doctor. I'm afraid I'm not, and I won't dare to take that title. But it's the discussions we've been having with our partners. As you know, the OSCE has 11 partners for cooperation. And yes, we've been talking to those Asian partners as well and trying to see if that because this has come out of a severe understanding of the gravity of the polarized world during the Cold War in the 70s or earlier. So that sense of urgency lifted the Helsinki Final Act and eventually included in the Final Act various CSBMs which already were ingrained in that document. Will we ever get there by explaining it and showing it to other areas? I sincerely hope so, because not only that, we also have, as you know very well, the Code of Conduct on political military aspects of security, which I think has some fantastic elements in there, which could serve also as an example for many other areas in the world. But if you ask me, are we doing enough with that? No, I think we can do more. And I think we can definitely have more of this awareness and outreach and trying to go to other regions and show what we have done. So I think still that what we have is what we should cherish. We shouldn't throw it away and easily say there is non-compliance everywhere. That's definitely not the case, as I hope that my numbers have shown you. Thank you.
Thank you. Do any of the other doctors want to weigh in? Great. Well, Gustavo, I'm not sure we have anybody else in the queue.
We do have, Congressman, we have a request from the floor from Austria. I cannot see the name from here. Could you?
Mr. Anton Aischer.
Mr. Anton Aischer from Austria, please.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for the presentations of all three of you. I think there's a very good knowledge about the situation as we are in now. Especially Ian Anthony is very well known in the OSCE community, and we as military advisors have very often listened to your presentations, and I think you again hit the bullseye, I would say, when you say that the circumstances now are very different than those when the Vienna document was established. I only want to raise 2 points and may ask a question to the guest speakers. One would be the point, Ian, you mentioned regarding the political level, including and the decision made. We do have, so to say, the day-to-day business formats where we discuss transparency measures and predictability. It's a form for security cooperation. On the one side, we have the structured dialogue. But as you say, this is all something which is on diplomacy. It's a discussion, but without recognition or the recognition of the political level, we would turn around in circle and we would not move forward. The next possibility to have such a step would be, I think, the Ministerial Council in Stockholm, where again, our ministers of foreign affairs are going to meet and they would discuss not only transparency measures, but they would discuss all the broad aspects of the comprehensive concept of security. And we would, as always, have a large focus on the human dimension. Maybe there's also for the second dimension and less on the first dimension. But I would ask you, would this be a possibility where the Parliamentary Assembly could influence and at least highlight the importance in a time when the erosion of arms control is seen by withdrawing from the cornerstones of the arms control regime in Europe, like the Open Skies and the CFE Treaty? I think the Parliamentary Assembly has an important role to play and to raise awareness about this crucial, or I would say worrying situation as we're in now. Yeah, this is the first thing I wanted to ask you. And the second one is about the disconnect. You have been discussing now a lot about the Vienna Document, but within the OSCE and within the Forum for Security Cooperation, we always discuss the Vienna Document in connection with arms control, Convention on Arms Control. And I haven't heard you talking about arms control measures, because arms control as such is wider than the Vienna Document, which is only on confidence and security building measures. Arms control as such has, of course, a large part of arms control measures include CSPMs, but they are wider than. And I think you cannot discuss, it is my personal view, you cannot discuss transparency measures or predictability without discussing arms control measures. So how do you think about that? This would be interesting to listen to you. Thank you.
Yeah, to take the issues in turn, I think the December meeting could be a very interesting opportunity, at least for me sitting in Stockholm, since Sweden has the chairpersonship in office. This vertical connection, I think, probably does require the chair in office to take a central place. And the challenge would be to put onto the desk of the chairperson a document that they could understand and digest and use in their conversations with their peers. I think that's really the challenge. And there has to be a document which contains the key information, but doesn't contain too much information. I mean, if you look at the content of the reporting mechanisms that the OSCE has, it's unreasonable to expect a foreign minister to digest all of that statistical data. So finding the right format to put on the desk of the chair, I think, is the problem to solve. In terms of arms control, I always think there are several phases to arms control, and the negotiation of an agreement is not the first one. The first phase is an understanding and a decision on what problem it is you're trying to solve. The second phase is the construction of the mandate, and it's only after that you come to the issue of the negotiations. And I don't think it's possible to short circuit that process. So at the moment, the main issue is to come to a common understanding of what problem we're trying to solve. And for me, the most important one right now is the one I pointed to around crisis instability. I think we're coming to a point now where there are just unacceptable levels of risk to the things that are being done in the OSCE area of operations. And so crisis stability and war avoidance seems to me to be the highest priority.
Dr. Huser, do you want to comment on that?
Very briefly, in the period, as I'm doing this empirically from the past, what was particularly crisis destabilizing in the past were things like flyovers and aircraft that sort of were flying in pathways that they weren't intended to. Let me just remind you of the two terrible accidents of the 1980s. The first one was the shootout down of the KAL 007 aircraft, which had strayed off course. So that was an accident, and then the shoot down was a misunderstanding. And the other one is the not very much later that the newest ships shot down an Egyptian aircraft. So again, serious misunderstandings, serious issues there. And a lot of this, this is why flyovers, I think, are particularly dangerous. And the same, I think, holds true for submarine actions, when you have submarines trailing each other and doing things which are just sort of wild goose chases underwater, but getting too dangerous. Again, in the 1980s, there was a lot of that, and that was pretty a crisis furthering. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Gustavo, I'll turn this over to you to continue to moderate. I think it'll be easier for you than for me and my limited ability here. But Gustavo, I'll let you continue to work the queue of questions.
Yeah, thank you very much, Congressman. We have another request for the floor from the US, and the name was, please?
I am actually, it's Dimitra Pappas. I'm guilty of using my deputy's login.
Dimitra Pappas, please. Go ahead.
Sorry. No, I was just struck by something that Dr. Anthony just said. Good to see you again, Dr. Anthony. What problem are we trying to solve? Is it the problem of recurring conflicts? Is it the nature of conflicts themselves, and this issue of blurring threshold between competition and conflict? And if those are the problems, are there arms control solutions readily available to that problem set? I mean, I think that's a fundamental question that we kind of skirt around. We just assume that there are arms control solutions, and maybe that is part of a solution. But can that address the conflicts that are exploding in the OSCE area at the current time? Can it address the issues of hybrid warfare? Very difficult to do so under those circumstances. The second thing I just wanted to react to something that was said earlier. We understand that the Vienna Document Modernization Proposal is really a modest update, but but if you can't get that much, how do you get to that further step of so-called real modernization? If you can't take the first step, how do you jump ahead to the 10th step? Those are my two questions. Thank you.
Well, I think your point about arms control is well taken. Again, if you go back to the situation that existed around the time of the Lisbon document, arms control was never expected to carry the full weight of managing security problems in Europe. We talked about a web of interlocking agreements, but it wasn't understood as a web of interlocking arms control agreements. That was the time when we were trying to institutionalize NATO-Russia relations, NATO-Ukraine relations. So a mutually supporting set of agreements, of which arms control is one part, seems to me to be the way to address it. And within that arms control basket, I think it's trying to isolate those systems that are most dangerous from the point of view of crisis stability. That seems to me to be where to focus the attention now. Countries are engaged in modernization programs for their military, and those are going to continue. Countries are not going to abstain because they regard those programs as necessary. So it's how to make sure that those programs take place within a framework that is transparent and non-provocative. That is the problem.
Thank you very much. We now have a request from the floor from Armenia. Is Maria Martirosyan, please.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator, and thank you, the panelists, for their presentations, interesting presentations. I would like to touch upon the remarks of Dr. Jan Anthony and also the remarks by Robin from the CPC. Dr. Anthony touched upon the NK conflict and the issue of military exercises, that what happened in Nagorno-Karabakh was not a surprise. Yes, it was not a surprise because, for many years we have been voicing our concerns in the OSCE about the unnotified large-scale military exercises by Azerbaijan, and that it resulted in war once already in 2016. And we were warning the OSCE participating states and the OSCE as an organization that the military exercises are used to prepare for a war, for another war against Artsakh. So Dr. Jan Anthony mentioned the problem of vertical communication of information, and there were remarks by Robin that we should think about what is important enough. We should differentiate between the information, what is important and what is not. And I would like to ask Dr. Anthony, in your opinion, what is the problem with the OSCE, and what are the problems with this information sharing when the participating states keep informing and warning the OSCE forum, the OSCE participating states about the early warning signals, and the organization and the participating states cannot react and cannot prevent atrocities and crimes? Thank you.
I don't have a two-sentence answer to that excellent question. I mean, I think it's probably time for a more thorough reassessment of the way in which the conflict cycle is addressed in the OSCE context. We have a document inside the OSCE which looks at the different parts of the conflict cycle. It's more than 10 years old, I think, and things have changed in ways that probably require a revision. What we can say with certainty is that the existing system for early warning and conflict prevention didn't work. This we can say as a fact.
I think my name was mentioned as well. I'm happy to also reply. I think I'm not entirely certain if, which I've said many times on previous occasions as well, that either the Vienna Document or the MC3-11, as it's called, the MC decision related to conflict cycle, is broken. It all has to do with how states wish to implement them. And if signals are there, which I don't think I've denied that they are there, then it's up to states to live up to them. They need to take charge and feel accountable, or at least feel addressed, and act upon them. My part of vertical communication was mainly focused at capitals, backing capitals, where I think there's a disconnect between many years of very routine information exchange and verification exercises or verification activity, units bringing back reports on what's going on in another country, and whether or not that triggers a higher political level back in the capitals is a different question. That is the vertical one which I was referring to, not necessarily in the OSCE or during the discussions which are held in either the FSC or the PC. But I do think that it's up to individual participating states to look at that information, which is all there. I don't think there's anything left out of what comes to the surface, is if at least every state acts up to its commitments, which I'm still assuming that they do. And obviously, if they don't, when you don't know, you don't know. So there's no agreement which can prevent that. If it's not being forwarded or not being exchanged, then there's nothing to act upon. And of course, if one state mentions X, Y, or Z about another state, then it needs to be assessed. It needs to be assessed with preferably fact-based information. And that's very difficult to find in certain areas and certain time space. So this is definitely an issue which is, again, not very easy to solve. But I don't think that necessarily the organization as such should be either be blamed for not doing something. It's, I mean, the organization of the OSCE itself and its executive structures have mandates within which they operate. So it's not like a peacekeeping organization which can go out on itself and have fact-finding missions whenever they see fit. That works usually quite well within organizations which are a group of states which have the same set of values. But within the OSCE, that is obviously, I think, a bridge too far. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We don't have anybody else in our list of speakers. Congressman Hudson, I don't know if you would like to say a few words before we ask our President, Lord Bowness, who's connected. I would like to say the concluding remarks. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Gustavo. Colleagues, I'd like to offer an opportunity for our speakers if they have any closing thoughts. Dr. Heuser, I'll call you first.
Very briefly, I would very much like to, in the near future, organize a project on different worldviews. And I'm picking up precisely from what Mr. Mossenkopf said at the end, of different perspectives on how international relations work, even among members of the OSCE. If anybody's interested in this or would even know how to finance such a conference, please get in touch. I'd be very grateful, and I'd very much like to organize this. I think that might clear the air and help us think differently. Thank you.
Thank you. And Mr. Mossenkopf.
I'd just like to thank you for giving me the opportunity to share some of my views, because obviously within the FSC, we're always supposed to be in the background. I'm always happy to share some of the views we have. I would like to make still a short marketing pitch for the security chat, which we'll have on Wednesday, 4:30. I did notice Dr. Anthony already writing up for that. On the framework for arms control, the Lisbon document, and its nexus towards emerging technologies. So I'd like to all make sure that you've all heard that. You can see it on the OSCE website. You can log in there. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Anthony.
No, just to thank you again for the chance to address the group. Thank you.
Thank you. And before I close, I would like to call on our president, Lord Bonus. As I said in the outset, really appreciate your strong leadership in these very challenging times. Lord Bonus, you're recognized.
Well, thank you very much, Congressman Hudson. May I thank you for your initiative in arranging this meeting, and also add my thanks to our speakers who have covered a wide range of activities, which I'm sorry to say, I suspect are not widely known even amongst the members of the Parliamentary Assembly. And to that extent, I wish that there had been more parliamentarians joined up this afternoon to hear what is being said. One of the most important points, I think, was made by Dr. Anthony when he said, and I hope I paraphrase accurately, that the OSCE should pay attention to how the information is used and how you get it up the line to national governments and to parliaments. As I say, all this activity takes place in the OSCE, the FSC meeting weekly. I commend its website to anybody who's interested in this subject, which sets out all their activities, all of which are crucial to the whole peace and security remit of OSCE in our region. But it goes nowhere and helps no one if we are speaking just amongst ourselves in a kind of closed community. So it's a different take on a message which I think we've found from a number of these webinars, that many of the things that we want to see happen are only going to happen with the active involvement of government and the responsibility of parliamentarians to bring these matters to the notice of their governments. It's particularly important in this subject when in many instances we're talking about peace or conflict. So I thank you, Congressman Hudson, for arranging this. I thank all our speakers and hope that it will get more coverage in the future of what OSCE does in this vital field. Many thanks indeed, and it was a pleasure to be able to join you.
Well, thank you, Mr. President. I think that was very well said. Colleagues, this has been a terrific discussion. We are going to make the video of this webinar available to all of my colleagues, and so I do believe we will get a very wide dissemination of this, and I think it is very crucial to our ongoing discussions and our work. So I just want to thank all of our speakers today for your contributions. I want to thank the interpreters, without whom we could not talk to each other in many cases, and the professionals from the Secretariat who organize all of our meetings. Thank you all. As you know, the General Committee on Political Affairs and Security will next formally convene on the 2nd of July as part of our Assembly's hybrid annual session. Thank you all very much. This concludes the webinar.